Should I start?
We are ready. Can you start?
Okay. Okay. I try to share my screen and hopefully it works. Can you see my slides now? Okay. Can you tell me if you see my slides?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Okay. Thank you very much for the invitation, Joanna and Sylvia, and also the rest of the group working hard, and also thanks for the introduction. So this talk is about self-supervised learning for multi-spectral and hyperspectral foundation models. I start by giving an introduction to self-supervised learning and foundation models. We go into details of two different groups of self-supervised learning: joint embedding self-supervised learning, joint embedding-based self-supervised learning, and massive image modeling. And then Nassim will talk about geospatial foundation models. He gives you a few examples and discuss few examples for multi-spectral foundation models, hyperspectral foundation models, multi-sensor multi-modal foundation models, and also how to evaluate geospatial foundation models. And then we conclude the talk. And then after the break, we will have the hands-on session. So why do we need self-supervised learning? So as we all know by now, deep learning models, they need a lot of labeled data, and we don't have a lot of labeled data. It's very expensive and also hard to annotate data in larger scale, and it's very costly as well. So on the other hand, we have a lot of unlabeled data, satellite archives, particularly for Earth observation and remote sensing. We have satellite archives with a petabyte of data. So we are looking basically in some ways to use these huge amount of data. And also, if you use self-supervised learning, our model will be transferable. So if you start training a deep learning model from scratch based on your label, your model won't be transferable to other tasks, or not sometimes even with the same task. But self-supervised learning-based models, they give you this opportunity and this advantage. But what is self-supervised learning? So we pre-train a model to capture the intrinsic characteristic of data. It could be a spectral characteristic, spatial or temporal. So what we do basically, we use our unlabeled data to train often a big model. And then we transfer this model to our desired downstream task. And with a few label data that we have, we can further fine-tune and adapt it to our desired downstream task. But the main question here is how we can pre-train a model without having any label. So we can use pretext task for self-supervised learning. Basically, the idea is to apply a transformation to our data, and then the model learns how the data was transformed, or how to reconstruct the original data. For instance, we can use in painting, masking part of the data, and then reconstruct the masked part So the model learns how to reconstruct the mask board. For instance, jigsaw puzzle solving, the model learns how to solve this puzzle. Then we have also rotation or rotation plus color distortion, a mixture of these two. And then the model, for instance, in this case, should learn that these are two views of one sample. So these are called pretest tasks. Okay, before continuing with different groups of self-supervised learning, let's briefly discuss what we call a foundation model. There are so many definitions out there, but for us, a foundation model is a large scale AI pre-trained model that gives a foundation to do further tasks, further downstream tasks. And we often use a big unlabeled, we use big unlabeled data and self-supervised learning to train our model. But this is not always the case. So you can always, if you have data, a lot of data, you can also use labeled data to create a foundation model. And then geospatial foundation model basically are pre-trained based on geospatial data, and then we can adapt it to a wide range of downstream Earth observation and spatial analysis tasks. So that's our definition. So let's move on with self-supervised learning. Generally, we can divide them into two main or three main categories. Joint embeddings. The idea is to have basically a similar projection on different views of one sample. And another group is mask image modeling. The idea is to kind of mask part of the data and reconstruct the data. And we have also a group, a hybrid group, that they do masking plus joint embedding, so get the advantage of both of these groups. We discuss all these groups. So let's start by joint embedding. So the general idea is based on the Siamese architecture with shared parameters. So we create similar views using data augmentation from our sample, and then we enforce invariance through some loss function to our augmentation. But the problem raises here is collapsing, which means that all the inputs map to almost the same vector, and that causes problems, and we have to find some solution for this. So we can roughly divide our self-supervised learning and methods, which are based on joint embedding, to 4 different categories: contrastive methods, clustering methods, distillation or self-distillation-based methods, and regularization-based methods. And we go into details of these 4 categories, and just to and maybe 1 or 2 examples of each of these like models for each of these categories, that so you can get a kind of idea how they work and what's the difference between these categories. So we start with contrastive methods. So the main idea behind this is pull positive pairs close to each other in our embedding space, and push the negative pairs apart. So push them apart from the negative pairs. So how do we do this? We use a contrastive loss to do this. And this requires negative samples or large batch sizes. But this is very good for multimodal data, such as CLIPS is based on this idea. CLIP is based on this idea. And we discussed about the 2 models, SimCLR and MOCO. Before starting with SimCLR, I briefly mentioned data augmentation, which is used with, in most of joint embedding models. And these are the most of the augmentation techniques that use, I think it's, yes, using SimCLR. And we do crop and resizes, color distortion, different type of color distortion, rotation, cutout, Gaussian noise, blur, and some filter, and these are used in SimCLR model. And random crop and resize are the two most important ones for us. So let's start with SimCLR. So I only put the name of the models that are very famous in computer vision and in the title for the slides, but you also get the reference here. So to save time, I don't discuss the full name, but you can see it in the bottom of the slides. So the main idea for SimCLR is basically, as you see from this GIF, that you create two different augmentation, and then you pass it through some kind of backbone, and then you apply a kind of a projection head, and you try to pull these two similar views to next to each other in your embedding, and repel them or pull them apart from the other samples in your batch. So that's the main idea. And how we do it is we just use this kind of loss function. Just to briefly explain this. So basically, if you have like a pair of like the embedding ZI and ZJ that are positive views, and we want them to be close to each other or similar to each other. Therefore, you apply a similarity function on top of it. In this case, it's cosine similarity, which brings them together. And for the negative pairs, we basically put them in the denominator because we want them to be far from each other. And basically, and then after that, you apply a softmax form function to get a probability distribution, and that's the main idea behind this type of loss. And these particular loss called antecedent loss. So yes, also we have a temperature tau value, which basically controls the sharpness of the softmax and how much you want these samples to be close. So this is a simple, very effective model, and but requires a very large batch size, and false negatives may will degrade actually the performance. So mode-coded momentum contrast it's another method, which the main idea is based on using a dynamic dictionary for negative samples, and they uses Curie encoder, two different encoder. Again, it's a joint embedding Curie encoder. Curie encoder basically gets updated through gradients, but this time the momentum encoder or Qi encoder it gets updated by a momentum from Curie encoder. We also call this EMA exponential moving average, and basically it's a kind of exponential moving average on the Curie samples, and the Curie parameters from the Curie encoder and Qi encoder. And so the main idea is basically the negative samples come from a dictionary Q, and when this dictionary gets full, then it's first in, first out rules for this dictionary. So they use influency loss, this loss, which is a contrastive loss, again, similar to one from SimCLR. And with similar idea, so Q and K plots are positive pairs, and you apply a similarity function on top of it, and then Ki, they are coming from a dictionary, the negative samples, and you want to basically pull them apart from your positive sample. So we can use, in this way, we can use large and consistent set of negative without needing huge batch size. This was the problem with SimCLR. And but extra memory and computation to maintain an update dictionary we need. So there are other versions of this model, Moco V2 and Moco V3. In Moco V2 is just they use a stronger augmentation and also use a multiple rejection head. In this sense, they get more similar to SimCLR. And in Moco V3, they use VIT backbone, and they also drop the explicit dictionary. And the negative comes from the mini batch. So these two examples are coming from the contrastive, the two main popular models from contrastive methods. So now we move to clustering methods. In case if any question, you can ask. I don't know. I cannot hear you, but maybe we do it later on because I don't have your audio. Okay, so I could just continue. Clustering methods is the next group of self-supervised learning. So the main idea are embeddings by grouping similar samples into clusters without explicit negative. So the key property is jointly learned representation and cluster assignments. We discussed SWAP, method called SWAP, and also deep cluster. Deep cluster is not joint embedding, but intuitively is very helpful to understand the idea behind this group. So we start by deep cluster. It's very simple. So the idea is very simple. You cluster the data that you have using k-means, and then basically you create this pseudo label based on this clustering, and then you use this for training your network. And every few epochs, you iteratively update your labels, and you do this basically this iterative process throughout the learning. It's simple, effective, but it does not scale very well with data center. Okay, now we move to SWAP, which is also a clustering-based model. So SWAP uses compute codes by assigning features to prototypes. The codes are basically the soft cluster assignment vectors, and prototypes are basically the cluster centers, and they're learned throughout the learning with a kind of online clustering methods that we don't discuss. And the main idea behind this is swapping assignment between the views. Basically, the code Q from one view is used as a target for another view. So for two views, X1 and X2, for instance, we have our probability predicted P1 for view 1, and then we have a target Q2, which is assignment of V2, view 2. And similarly for view 2, we have the same thing, and then for the loss function, we try to basically we average the cross entropy between these two, the cross entropy between the probability, the predicted probability, and the target one. So it's we don't use negative samples here. We don't need negative samples, but these make collapse. So next group is distillation-based methods. The core idea basically is to use a teacher-student-based network. So the student network matches the output distribution of the teacher. The student gets updated through gradient, but the teacher uses EMA exponential moving average for the updates. We discussed about two models quickly, Viol and Dino, and this group works without negative samples, but relies on asymmetric architectures to avoid collapse. So it's simple, powerful, no need for large batches of negative samples, but more prone for collapsing. Okay, we start by Biol, which was Biol. It's very simple. As we said, we have two different branch, one or encoder. One is the student encoder, which is also called online encoder, is paper. And then the teacher one, which is target encoder. And the teacher gets updated through email, exponential moving average. Students uses backpropagation for update. And Biol also uses predict MLP only for the student branch. And basically, they use L2 loss to enforce invariance between these two branches. Now we move to Dino, self-distillation without labels. Very similar architecture, student-teacher-based architecture. Teacher gets updated using email. But this time they use softmax to basically to probability, and then apply as a loss function. They apply cross entropy loss. So for avoiding collapse, they use some tricks. They do centering the output of the teacher, and also they use another trick called sharpening, and it's just nothing but based on this setting the temperature value for this teacher probability very small, so it gets very sharp, the probability, predicted probability. And the center will be updated also using email. Center basically is the mean of the batch. And yeah, this is very simple, but then later on in next version of these models, now we have some cool videos here to show these are next versions of these models, Dino V2 and Dino V3. Later on, they realized, for instance, in Dino V2 that they don't need these tricks to avoid collapsing with kind of architecture. And large curated data set. Basically, they avoid collapsing. So this is basically the result of Dino V2. As you see that the features, it's pretty impressive that how these features are very similar to the actual window. And then this is a real image from, I hope you see it on the screen when I'm playing it, from the Dino V3. This is a real image and the principal component analysis and canopy height estimation done without any label. And the last one, the most interesting one from the Dino V2 as well, you see here object detection, semantic segmentation, and depth estimation, basically in this view from these versions. So yeah, the next and the last one is the last group from joint embedding is regularization-based methods for idea encourage embeddings to be decorrelated across dimensions and maximize information for per features. And they avoid the collapsing by penalizing correlation between embedding dimension, and they don't need any negative samples. And we discussed Barlow twins and Big Rec very briefly, just to give a kind of idea. So for piloting, the core idea is very simple. Basically, the architecture has an encoder and the projector as well for both branch, and you calculate the cross correlation matrix. You compute the cross correlation for both for these two views, and you enforce invariance through these loss functions. So basically what this loss function does is, for the first time, you enforce the diagonal one to be close to zero, diagonal elements or entries. And the second term, which is a redundancy reduction, basically enforces the off diagonal to be close to zero. So basically by minimizing these loss, that's how you design your model. So this is very simple, objective, non-negative Qs or email, but requires high dimensional embeddings. Then we have BIC-reg or BIC-reg, and follow similar idea, but try to kind of decouple the terms into three different terms: invariance, variance, and covariance. And basically, just to give you an idea of what's the point of every of these terms in the loss function. So the first one basically enforces invariance through MSE, and the second one helps to avoid collapsing, putting kind of limit for the variance. And then the covariance basically decorrelate features dimension by enforcing covariance of each view or off diagonal elements of those covariance to be equal to zero. So that's the whole idea behind BIC-reg, and uses three terms for the loss function, which is a bit more complicated than balloting. Okay, now we move to, so this was the story behind joint embedding groups and different model. Now you have kind of idea how this joint embedding model work for self-supervised learning. And the next big group for idea is mask image modeling. So splitting an image into patches and mask a subset, and learn from these visible subsets to reconstruct the rest of the image. So basically, for mask image modeling, we often use L2 reconstructions. So encoder applies to visible mask, particularly for mask autoencoders. They only work based on the visible patches. So visible patches go through an encoder, and then you apply a decoder to reconstruct the data, and L2 loss functions for the reconstruction. So they generally or mainly use VIT backbones because they accept sequence of patches. So just to remind you, why most of mask image modeling they use VIT. So as most of you most probably familiar with, also in VIT you get your image and you create a sequence of patches and you pass it through kind of linear projection, and then you add positional embedding, and then basically it goes through the attention mechanism and the encoder part. So this tends to be very, very useful for impeding task, and does a very good job to reconstruct the signal, and also in terms of getting deep features for your encoder. So mask encoder basically also uses VIT for decoder and to basically predict the mask patches. So this idea is simple, efficient, suitable for low-level downstream tasks, denoting super resolution, but weaker for high-level tasks. So there are other models based on this idea, but mask autoencoders are the most efficient ones and also most widely used one, particularly in remote sensing Earth observation. For instance, SIMMIM is another model based on this idea and came out more or less at the same time. They use both visible and not visible, so both our mask patches. They pass them through the encoder, and therefore they are not as efficient as mask autoencoders. And then they use only one linear layer as a prediction head, and they also use L1 loss. There are other ideas like mask fit, which is basically, instead of doing regression, pixel-based regression like mask autoencoders, they try to do feature regression. So they have kind of handcrafted features, create handcrafted features out of the data, and they try to predict those features. There's also this similar idea with BIT, but it's based on token prediction. So they have kind of layered embedding to create tokens IDs, and then they try to basically predict tokens. So here is an example of reconstructions using a mask autoencoder. This is Nmap data from Spectral Earth, and you also see it later on throughout the hands-on session. Here, as you see, the hyperspectral data from Nmap got masked for 90%, but still we get a very good reconstructions based on VIT backbone, which is very helpful and for the reconstructed image. And it does a very good job, mask autoencoder, to do this in painting for us. And this is up to 90% masking, so 90% of your data is gone. So just to sum up, kind of compare joint embedding versus mask image modeling. So for joint embedding, they create for us, produce for us highly semantic features, which are great for classification tasks. They're architecture agnostic. You can use CNN or VAT or other architectures. And competitive results in linear probing, they may require a large batch size, require tuning the augmentations, and special care for negative samples or collapsing. And they're not a good fit for low-level tasks. They don't fit very well for low-level tasks. On the other hand, mask image modeling computation conceptually simple and no positive negative pairs. Computationally, they're efficient and negative competitive results with fine-tuning, strong fit for low-level tasks like denoising and super resolution. And then they require PIT backbone. And they're weaker for abstract or high-level tasks like classification. So the final example for self-supervised learning is this joint, so there's a mixed idea or hybrid idea that is a method called IJEPA, image-based joint embedding predictive architecture. They use both masking and joint embedding. They combine these two ideas. So the core idea is to predict kind of abstract representation rather than the pixel level regression that we were doing or prediction that we were doing in mask image modeling. Here the core idea is to predict or reconstruct abstract representation instead of the pixels. So we have a context encoder which basically encodes the visible part of our context or context patches. And then we have a predictor, and this predicts patch level embedding for our target blocks, and the target blocks basically they come from the target encoder, and our target doesn't get masked here, so we don't mask target, we encode the target entirely, and then we apply kind of masking or selection for the after encoding the target. And they use L2 loss between these predictions and the ground truth target to reconstruct the data. So it's simple, no negative samples or cues, but we can feed for low-level tasks like denoising and super resolution again. So after this, I think we go to geospatial foundation models, and I think Nassim will continue from here to give you different examples and different models from different groups of geospatial foundation models.
So hi everyone, thanks again for the invite to the summer school. Thank you Behnood for covering the basics of SSL in the first part. Okay, maybe now would be a good time for questions. So abstracting away all the details of specific methods, what I want you to get for the rest of the lecture is you have two families of methods. Joint embedding architectures, where you take an image, you create two versions of it with data augmentation, and then you force the network to learn invariance to these augmentations. That's your training objective. And then masked autoencoders, you mask part of the image, you try to reconstruct it. So are there any questions with respect to these principles? Is it clear, or is there anything you'd like to clarify? Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I just had like, you mentioned that with masked image modeling, it doesn't work well with high-level tasks. So like what works well with high-level tasks? Like what is the problem there?
Okay, so what Behnood meant is the two methods, families of methods, we kind of learn different features. And with masked autoencoder, you're reconstructing pixels. So you learn kind of local features. And they're not necessarily very semantic in the sense of clustering images of dogs together and cats together. So that's what he meant. Okay. So it will be good for segmentation, but then without fine-tuning for classification, it doesn't cluster the features as well as the other methods, like joint embedding architecture.
So like fine-tuning would be required, that's the...
So one is more image level, high level semantic representation. The other is more pixel level, fine-grained details. And you have approaches combining both to get the best of both worlds. But yeah, but anything else on the really fundamentals, or can we continue? Okay, good. Just for me to know how to, go ahead.
Do you know the motivation of developing the regularization-based methods? I don't get what is the motivation of creating a loss function based on 3 terms, for example, okay. The invariance, variance, and covariance.
That's a little bit more into details already, just high level, but then we can discuss offline.
Okay.
So joint embedding architecture, you have the image, or you augment it twice, you get 2 views, and you want the embeddings to be similar. what could happen is your network just outputs a constant function, everything is similar, and it's useless. So you have to control somehow maybe the variance of your embeddings and these kind of things. You want an embedding space that is spread out. You want your data to span your embedding space. And that's what regularization methods do. They play with the variance of the data essentially and try to avoid this collapse thing. That's roughly the idea, but that's already more technical. If you have understood at least the two families, then we're good to go. Out of curiosity here, raise your hand the people who are from more computer science backgrounds, mathematics, data science. Okay, about 1/5 or something. And who's from remote sensing? Okay, who's from both? Yeah, actually. Nice, okay, pretty cool audience. Okay, it's good for me to know where to focus maybe. All right, well, let's get started. So Behnood covered the basics of self-supervised learning computer vision. I'm gonna try to go through the remote sensing parts of it and so show you how these methods have been used in remote sensing. Yeah, Behnood already motivated this at the beginning, but basically, why would you care about self-supervised learning in remote sensing? Well, this is a graph from the USGS website. So it shows you the data download over the years from 2008 to 2025 for Landsat data. And you can see that the volume in terabyte is already more than 200,000 terabytes. And that's just for Landsat data. Then you can add Sentinel on top of it. You can add other missions, Nmap, this and that, MODIS, climate data. So we're talking about, yeah, hundreds and hundreds of petabytes of imagery, essentially. And so the good news is we have huge archives of data, images from different satellites. On the other hand, ground truth is really rare, very costly to obtain, and yeah, no one really has it. So the question is, if you want to do deep learning for remote sensing, can we exploit these massive amounts of data here and deal with few labels to enable a practical use case of deep learning in remote sensing? And that's where self-supervised learning comes into play. So what would stop you from taking a model pre-trained on ImageNet, computer vision, and just use it on remote sensing data and call it a day? The problem is, so people did that on RGB, high-resolution data. It kind of works compared to just training from scratch. But you also have quite a big distribution shift compared to remote sensing data. And so if you want to apply ImageNet model trained to recognize or trained on images of dogs and cats, it may not work very well on Sentinel-1 SAR data. So that's one thing which motivates the idea of pre-training your own model on your data. And then once you do that, well, you could just apply MOCO or whatever algorithm Behnood presented earlier on remote sensing data, and that's it. And then we go for the coffee break. But the thing is, you may want to do something better in terms of exploiting the specifics of your data. And you have some things in remote sensing that you may not have in natural imagery. For instance, your data is geolocated. It has timestamps. So the satellite will go over the same location at multiple timestamps, multiple seasons, and you can use this information in your pre-training algorithm. You also have domain-specific metadata, like things with the orbit, angle, whatever, you name it. And you also have multiple sensors, which is both an opportunity and a challenge. So you will have sensors of various spatial resolution from a few centimeters to, like, I don't know, 60 meter, 500 meters. You also have a variant spectral resolution from RGB to hyperspectral. And you need to incorporate all this information in your pre-training algorithm. And you also have many pre-processing pipelines. So just for Sentinel-2, you'll have L1C, L2A, this and that, and data quality issues, clouds, noise, NaN values, etc. Okay, so I'm gonna try to cover, or at least give you an overview of the literature when it comes to self-supervised learning in remote sensing in a kind of chronological way. So there's a lot of research in SSL. We'll only be able to cover part of it. Early works, let's say from 2020 to 3 years ago, we're focusing on small single sensor models. So you could, this category basically, where you have, a bunch of Sentinel-2 imagery, you pre-train a model on it, you test it on downstream tasks. More recent research is focusing on, where are you, pointer? Where are you? I don't know where you are. There you are. So multi-sensor stuff, which could be fixed sensors or any sensors. So maybe you have one model that can work on both Sentinel-1, Sentinel-2, Nmap, etc., any sensor you want. And then you have the multi-model category, which is more for text and images, for instance. And this is by no means an extensive taxonomy. It's just a glimpse of the methods out there. I'm missing the temporal dimensions and many things here. But yeah, that's basically how we're gonna cover the rest of the slides through these aspects. Okay, okay, all right, geez. Let's start with RGB and multispectral foundation models, or SSL in general. One of the early works is called GeoMoco. So you'll see that all the names are very creative in the research community. And this paper exploits both geolocation and temporal information inside MoCo, which is a contrastive method. The way they do it is the following. So for a single location, you can get multiple timestamps through the year using whatever satellite you're working with. And this gives you, you could call it natural augmentations. If you take an image in winter, maybe there will be snow. If you take it in summer, I don't know, the crops have been harvested and everything is yellow. So you kind of get all these natural augmentations that reflect the distribution of the data. And that might be more interesting to use than, I don't know, artificial random color distortions that people will apply on ImageNet. So this is the first step. Instead of augmenting the same image twice, you will take two temporal positives, so two images of the same location at different timestamps, and use this as positive pairs. And like this, you're already teaching your model to learn invariance to this kind of temporal information in your data. Then, once you have the two views, you feed into the encoder, you apply your contrastive loss, So that's just MoCo that Behnood explained earlier. And the authors here add an additional pretext task. So this head here, this geolocation classification loss, it's exploiting the geospatial information. So you come with an image, you know where it comes from, you have the longitude and latitude, and then you ask the network from the embedding to try to predict these values. So it will try to guess where the image came from. It's an ill-defined problem, you can't really guess, but sometimes you can, you know, have a reasonable guess. If you have an image of a desert or something, maybe it's in Africa, so it's a good training signal to force the network to learn geospatially aware representations. So that's one way to do it. Another slightly fancier way, this is from the SICO paper in 221 ICCV. So these guys pushed the temporal thing a step further, and they said, you know what? My temporal views, I will take them explicitly from different seasons, because I know that the changes will be the most extreme there with seasonal changes and the phenology of plants, etc. So what they do is they take, again, MoCo, was a very popular algorithm back in the days, and they have their query image, which is an image, say, in winter, for instance, and then they generate the other positive pairs as follows. So they take one, they take the query, where are you? Query, and then they take another timestamp without any artificial augmentation from a different season. So image in winter, image in summer, no data augmentation. And then they take maybe an image in fall, and they apply data augmentation to it. And for the last one, they just take the same timestamp, so the image in winter, and they apply data augmentation. So they're basically playing with multiple levels of invariance. And you just wiggle around with all these positive pairs, because in the end, this is the same kind of information, right? It's the same location. So depending on which samples you use as positive pairs, you could be invariant to seasonal and data augmentation. So if you use all of these as positive pairs, you will teach your network to ignore these changes and be invariant to both seasonal contrast and data augmentation. If you select only these two guys, so the original timestamp and the one without augmentation from a different timestamp, you're only invariant to the seasonal augmentation. And if you take the same timestamp with the two augmentations, you're only invariant to data augmentation, like here. So they're basically playing with multiple levels of invariance, and they show that it kind of works, and it helps the network learn nice representations. This was a follow-up that was conducted at DLR with colleagues from DLR and TUM. And we collected the data set using Sentinel-1 and Sentinel-2 data, following a data sampling strategy that was introduced in SICO. with a few minor corrections to reduce the redundancy in the data. And back in the days, this was a pretty big data set, so it's 223, so ages ago in AI. And it was something like 1.5 terabytes of data, over 250K locations with 4 timestamps for Sentinel-1 and 4 timestamps for Sentinel-2. And we conducted a bunch of experiments using multiple pre-trained models with multiple algorithms, Dino, Moco, MAE, etc., on multiple downstream tasks. And the results were pretty promising. So back in the days, we saw some improvements that you get from pre-training, especially when it comes to label efficiency. So if you have less labels, the pre-trained model helps even more. And yeah. This was a follow-up that we did after SSL4EO, S12, which was with Sentinel-1 and Sentinel-2. And back in the days, you couldn't really find a lot of benchmarks or pre-training data sets with Landsat. So this is basically the same thing, but with Landsat covering multiple missions, 6, 7, 8, 9, with both top of atmosphere and surface reflectance products. And we pre-trained a few models, built a few downstream tasks, and kind of a benchmarking slash data set work. Okay, so this was for the RGB multispectral family that were relying on disjoint embedding architectures. There's also lots of papers that rely on MAE, mask autoencoder. So remember, you take an image, you mask part of it, you predict the rest, and you use a vision transformer for that. And in SAT-MAE, they take mask autoencoders and they introduce a temporal and a spectral aspect. So RGB remote sensing data has a lot of bands, Sentinel-2, maybe 12 bands if you're using L2A. And so, and you could also have time series of Sentinel-2 data. And this is basically what these guys try to do in this paper. So they try to encode or build a model that can process some time series and also encode the spectral bands separately to learn spectral features. So take an image of a certain location, and for simplicity, let's assume these are 3 timestamps from the same location, but just different timestamps. Since you're using a VIT, you have to cut them into small patches, right? So you have the first 4 patches for this guy, the second 4 for this one, and the last 4 for this one. Okay, so it's a VIT. You have to feed this sequence to your model. And this is where, in a VIT, you need the positional encoding to tell the model, look, this is the upper left corner of the image, or this is the bottom right corner. And if you only do that here, this guy and this guy will have the same positions because both of them spatially represent the same part of the image. So you also need to add an additional information to tell the model, you know what, this one is the first timestamp, this one is the second timestamp, and that's the difference between these two. And the way they do it is simply by, you could think of this as encoding the month, the year, the day of the image. So it's essentially kind of a timestamp added or concatenated with the position. The way they implement it doesn't matter, but you can just think of it as, yeah, date, time, etc., encoded in a certain way. And you can do the exact same thing with the spectral bands. So instead of concatenating all the bands for Sentinel-2, maybe you will concatenate the RGB together and treat them as one image, and then maybe you'll take the 20-meter bands or near infrared or whatever, and you encode them as a second image. And you have a model that can process all of this and learn spatial and temporal and spectral relationship. So that's basically SAT-MAE. And there is the scale MAE version, which from the name you can guess has something to do with the scale. So these guys introduce the ground sampling distance information into mask autoencoder. That's really the core idea. The way they do it exactly doesn't really matter, but at the high level idea is you have your images. Here they say it's 30 centimeter ground sampling distance. If you resize them, you crop them, etc., you can generate synthetic data, for which you can control the spatial resolution. So if you resize it by a factor of 2 or something like that, you will double the ground sampling distance. And with this information, you basically just run MAE, and as usual, you add the ground sampling distance encoding somewhere in the positional encoding. So that's usually wherever you want to add some metadata to the network, you put it at that step. And then they have the usual reconstruction, but they do it in 2 stages, low frequency features, high frequency features, but that doesn't really matter. in the end, it's all about encoding the spatial resolution of the image into your network to know what a pixel represents on the ground, essentially. Okay, there's this one that introduces a different idea, and it's very simple. So imagine by that time, 2023, we started already to have a lot of pre-trained models, both from the computer vision community and remote sensing. And the question these authors ask themselves is, do we have to start from scratch every time? Do we have to pre-train our model from scratch? Or can we benefit from the GPU hours wasted by other people to speed up maybe pre-training for us, or maybe to get a better model? And that's basically what these guys do. So they just take a student network, they train MAE or whatever mask autoencoder, mask image modeling method, and they have this additional branch, which is a teacher network that they don't train, they just take it as it is, someone else pre-trained it for them, and they feed in the full image, which gives them a certain embedding, and the argument is this embedding should be good, because this model, we took it because it's supposed to be good, and it has seen the entire image. So it kind of makes sense to ask the student network to predict this feature and kind of regress it in a way, in addition to the mask autoencoder last term. So it's essentially having a teacher to guide you a little bit and maybe speed up pre-training. Okay, last one on this category. This is Prithvi.io, blah, blah, blah. So maybe you've seen posts about this on LinkedIn and Twitter and you name it. And this is one of IBM and NASA's foundation models. So there's two of them here. They're all, both of them are based on mask autoencoder with tricks similar to SAT-MAE. And they train it, well, because it's NASA, they wanted to have something that works on Landsat, but they also didn't want to discard Sentinel-2, so they use this harmonized product that takes the common bands and aligns them and this and that to a common spatial resolution. And they have some, I would say, interesting insights when it comes to challenges of the scale of the data, the scale of the models, the compute, and all these aspects when you try to train your own foundation model. So I encourage you to read up on those two papers or have a look. Okay, so this was for multispectral RGB foundation models and SSL papers in general. Now let's move to hyperspectral foundation models, and this one will be much shorter because data sets to pre-train a hyperspectral foundation models aren't really that available. It starts to get some momentum now, starting from like last year or something, but before that there was basically no data to do large-scale pre-training with hyperspectral. So there's this paper, HyperSigma. They collected their own data set based on this Hyperion EO1 decommissioned mission from NASA. It's a hyperspectral satellite. And Gaofen 5, which is a Chinese hyperspectral satellite. They combined a bunch of tiles here and there. They got a data set which was relatively big, I would say, for the hyperspectral community. 450K patches, 64 by 64 pixels. And then, because it's hyperspectral, you have to do a little bit of fancy stuff here with spatial and spectral. But essentially, they have a spatial transformer, they have a spectral transformer. They fuse the features at the end. They train them independently, and that's it. From their results, it seemed like the spatial transformer was doing much of the work. And you'll get maybe an idea of why during the hands-on session, as you will observe how much spectral variability you have in hyperspectral data from multiple acquisitions, and it's very difficult to train a model that is robust to these kind of changes, seasonal changes, etc., discarding the spatial information and just relying on the spectrum. It's really difficult. And the other one, this I will only say a few words about it because the hands-on session is based on this. So this was a work we conducted at DLR and Spectral Earth paper, and the goal was basically to provide the community with a large-scale pre-training data set that involved hyperspectral data. And for this one, we used the NMAP satellite, which is Germany's hyperspectral satellite. And we collected the large-scale data set, which was an order of magnitude larger than what was available back in the days, or a few order of magnitudes, depending on how far you go back. And we also conducted a bunch of experiments on pre-training models and doing SSL, etc. So you get to play with a small subset of the data that is manageable on Google Colab today, and also maybe train your own MAE model on it, try it on some downstream tasks. I'll cover it a little bit better when it comes to the practical part. Okay, now the last section of the geospatial FMs, the real foundation models, one could argue. So the multi-sensor and multi-model foundation models. Okay, so here we want a model that will operate on many sensors, as many as we can, with as much data as we can. One early work that was conducted in this direction, so this was a joint paper at DLR and TUM by some colleagues, and what they did is essentially, if you have multiple sensors, say Sentinel-1 and Sentinel-2, you will be tempted to use them as positive pairs. So you could argue you have a certain location on the ground. Well, Sentinel-1 is one view of it, Sentinel-2 is another view, and there you go. You have your very nice augmentations that are even different sensors. The thing is, if you do this, you might run into the problem of struggling to preserve common and unique features. So the worst case is you don't learn anything useful, your representations collapse to the intersection of both sensors, and you kind of lose the spectral information from Sentinel-2 and get the noise from Sentinel-1, and you get very useless embeddings. So in order to do this properly, you need some mechanism to preserve the unique information, things that one sensor will see, but the other cannot see. And it makes sense to allow some flexibility in the embedding space to leave some room for this. And we did it in the simplest possible way. So you just take your embedding vector and you dedicate part of it to the unique features of each sensor. So here you have a Sentinel-1 image, Sentinel-2 image, 2 augmentations. You have a Sentinel-1 encoder, Sentinel-2 encoder. So this is classical Barlow twins that Behnood covered earlier, the joint embedding architecture method. And then during the in the loss function, let's focus on this. This is just intra-sensor loss. It doesn't matter. So this is the one that we're interested in. How do you combine Sentinel-1 and Sentinel-2? And the way we did it is basically by creating this cross-correlation matrix from Barlow twins and masking out or canceling the invariance terms for a subset of the embedding space. So you take some features and you say, look guys, these features, they will learn something that is not constrained to be aligned across the 2 sensors. And it kind of works. So if you visualize the t-SNE representations of the red parts here, so this is the common part of the embedding space for both Sentinel-1 and Sentinel-2, you will see that it's a pretty uniform thingy and that the features are very well mixed. But then if you look at so this is the common part of the information. And then if you look at the unique aspects, you'll see that they cluster very strongly. So the features learned by Sentinel-1 are very different from the features learned by Sentinel-2. And that's kind of what we want. We want to allow the model to learn something common and also give some flexibility to learn something different. Maybe I'll skip this one for sake of time. Okay, and then, let's cover this one. This one is interesting. So they go for multi-sensor, and they combine high-resolution RGB data with optical time series and radar time series. So up till this point, I think most of the models we've looked at, SAT-MAE is not one of them, but they mainly operate on one timestamp. So this one operates on 3 modalities, and for 2 of them, it also supports long time series. And the way they do it is, it's always kind of the same design. You have some layers that are sensor specific, so you need something still to encode what's specific about your data. And then you want to merge these embeddings. So after you're done with the sensor specific stuff, so green, red, blue, you do the masking, because it's MAE based. You fuse them somehow. There's some magic happening in some transformer here. You get some fused representations, and that's also what you want with these foundation models. You want an embedding space that, kind of homogenizes all the sensors that you have. And now you have to make these guys useful. So fusing, the features without doing anything interesting or without learning anything interesting is, not very relevant. So you have to make sure that these features preserve at least the information they got from each of the sensors, and maybe at least do more than that. And this is where the MAE loss comes. So starting from the merge features, you will reconstruct every sensor independently. And this is kind of how they ensure that you have useful representations that actually really merge the semantics of these 3 sensors. And the same authors did a paper which was published at CVPR this year. And for this one, it's basically the IJPA version of the previous slide. So Behnood covered it earlier. If you do mask image modeling, mask autoencoders, you reconstruct your data in the input space. If you do these hybrid methods, you usually reconstruct in the latent space. The argument is, you know, remote sensing data, there might be a lot of noise, a lot of things that you're not really interested in learning in the input space that might be, distract the network from what really matters. So you can go for latent reconstruction. And the way it works is, well, again, I think you're getting used to this now. You have some parts that are sensor specific. You have a teacher network, student network. This processes the patches individually for each sensor. Then they're merged. Again, some magic happening here. Then you get some embeddings which you want to be informative. If you were doing MAE, you would reconstruct in the input space. Since you want to do latent space reconstruction, you need a target. And your target is going to be this teacher network, which is also trained on the fly. And the advantage the teacher network has is that it sees the entire input. So this time, in this branch, you feed the entire input, you get the features, and the argument is these features should be more rich than these, because we didn't occlude anything from the input. So you just reconstruct, and there you go. Okay, TerraMind, I will not cover it technically. So that's IBM's latest foundation model. Maybe you've heard of it. And the cool thing about this one is it was sort of based on MAE with multiple modalities. And yeah, the cool thing about it is you can take one modality and generate another one using the encoder. Just because it was trained to do mask image modeling with multiple modalities, somewhere in the loss, you were getting a joint embedding space which reconstructs all the modalities. And because of that, you can just go through the right part of the network and maybe start from Sentinel-2 and go to Sentinel-1, for instance. Of course, it's kind of guessing, so the network's not gonna produce a real Sentinel-1 image, but maybe through some interesting correlation it has learned during pre-training and it has seen quite a lot of data, 9 million locations. Well, maybe sometimes it will guess something useful. And the authors then use this mechanism to introduce this thinking modality thing, which is essentially you take the modality you have available for your downstream task, you generate any other relevant modality using TerraMind. So again, it's kind of guessing. And then you add this modality in the input for the downstream task. So you say, maybe if I want to do flood mapping, I will take a Sentinel-2 image. I will generate the land cover, land use map using TerraMind. I will put it back as the input. Maybe it helps for flood mapping, for instance. And that's the kind of experiments IBM did and tried to show that it works in the TerraMind paper. Okay, I think I'll keep getting close to the end. I should also keep an eye on the time. Okay, so Panopticon. This one is a little bit different from the ones we covered in the sense that all the multi-sensor foundation models we've covered so far, they operate on a fixed set of sensors. So the ambition is I trained on Sentinel-1, Landsat 8, Sentinel-2, etc. And I'm going to claim that my model works very well for these 3, 4 sensors. So these guys take it a step further and say, you know what, let's train on many sensors and let's at least aim for generalizing to unseen sensors. So I come to you, I ask for your pre-trained model, I give you a sensor that your model has never seen, and I'm asking you to make it work, kind of, without additional training. And so the way they do it is if you want to generalize to sensors, you need to characterize the sensor. So if you come to me and you tell me I have a new sensor, can you make it work? I will ask you questions. What are the wavelengths? Like what's the spectral range, spatial resolutions, etc. And that's basically what the network does. It's asking questions to this little module. So the rest of it is based on DynoV2. So this is an existing computer vision model. And the part that the authors tweaked is here. So when you encode your batch, you want to incorporate some information to characterize your sensor. And here it's, for example, the sensor response function. So something that tells you how the sensor reacts depending on the wavelength. And yeah, you don't have to worry too much about the details, but it's something in the lines of taking every band as a separate token and having some attention that will merge all these guys, all the bands that your input has in a flexible way, so it needs to work with any number of bands, combined with the sensor response function, which you have to encode somehow, and some additional information. They also add some SAR-specific stuff, for Sentinel-1. So some magic happens in this little box, and you go from an arbitrary number of channels in your input, given the metadata, to a unified space, to a single token. So it's quite ambitious. The authors kind of show that it can work through some experiments, but it's also, early research. So yeah, there's still quite a lot of work to do to really be able to generalize to unseen sensors, and you have a lot of things to take into account. But this is, maybe one of the first steps, along with maybe 3 other papers. Okay, I think with the technical parts, we're done. The last few ones I want to cover is Alpha Earth. So maybe you've also heard of this. It has gotten wide coverage on, all sorts of platforms. And this is DeepMind's latest foundation model, geospatial foundation model. And well, it's DeepMind, so I have a lot of resources. And they trained this model with Sentinel-1, Landsat, Sentinel-2, Era 5, JEDI, anything you can think of, over, I think, something like 8 million locations, which itself is not too crazy. So TerraMind is like 9 million. But the crazy part is that they had dense time series over an entire year. So I think we're reaching maybe a few billion samples if you multiply by the length of the time series. So they have this gigantic data set. They use their 3,000 TPUs or something. And I'm not going to detail the training algorithm, but they kind of treat the input as a video over the year. And this produces embeddings. So in the end, you get one vector representing your pixel at the highest resolution of the input, which is Sentinel-2, 10 meters. So for every pixel, you get a 64 vector representation of that pixel aggregated over the year. So it has been calculated using time series over that year. And maybe the interesting part of how this model was released is that instead of releasing the weights, they computed these embeddings globally for 7 years or something, from 2017 to 2024. And they just calculated the embeddings using their model globally over data from all those years. And now it's a Google Earth Engine product. So you can just go there, ask for some coordinates somewhere, download those embeddings, and they have some pretty cool visualization of a PCA version of those embeddings. So you will see that if you're looking at crops, for instance, it's, you almost get kind of a segmentation map of different crops, etc. So it's pretty cool. The community still has to test on, relevant downstream tasks, how well this works. But this idea of having, let's say, embeddings as kind of geospatial products is something quite a lot of people are working on now. Even at DLR, we have a Horizon project on this to try to build kind of a next generation of AI-derived products for remote sensing, and embeddings is one option. Okay, there's also people who this is also a bit different from the other papers I presented earlier. So SatClip, Behnood briefly mentioned CLIP earlier. It's just contrastive learning between an image and a textual description of that image. So you have an image of a dog, you have a nice sentence describing it, you want to align the representations, and it allows you to do nice things like zero-shot learning, etc. So it's a pretty cool Google paper from a few years ago. And these people thought, let's do this with remote sensing. And of course, we don't really have text captions of our images. I don't know how useful that would be in the end. So the way they do it is they use the locations. The geolocation, that's kind of their text modality, and Sentinel-2 is the image modality. And so why would you even do this? One advantage is that you can bring the location information to your image embedding, but that we've already seen models doing that. Maybe the more interesting part, and what the authors focus on, is bringing the image information to the location embedding. So if you want to incorporate your embedding somehow, your location, sorry, somehow, and have some semantics on it. So for instance, if you have cities that are very different in Europe with very different architectures, maybe even if they're not too far away, maybe you want to have embeddings of their geolocation that are a little bit different. And conversely, if you have two patches over the desert in Africa and in the middle of the US that look similar, maybe you want to have these kind of relationships captured in your embeddings for certain downstream tasks. So it's quite specific. And this is what this allows you to do. You can basically add some semantic information through the how are the image looking into your geospatial coordinates. Okay, this is the last one. Not covering it technically, but all the models I've talked about now are operating on images. And they also need a little bit of training during the downstream task to have a task-specific head to do your segmentation or whatever task. There's also people working on promptable models. So you have a vision model, and you also have an LLM somewhere sitting, and you want to be able to ask questions about the image, like, I don't know, so they have examples here, visual Q&A, or how many tennis courts are visible, and then you want this little agent kind of to respond with the right numbers, and then maybe you want to do, I don't know, actually get the bounding boxes over certain objects. So it's, yeah, maybe it has some use cases. I think it's interesting that people are looking into it. Probably there's some, yeah, interesting interfaces that you could build around such systems, and there's a lot of work going into that direction. Okay, so after spamming you with 1,000 papers, we're coming close to the end. So I just want to cover something about how to use a foundation model. So we've introduced a lot of papers doing various tricks to adapt them to remote sensing data. And now the question is, I give you a checkpoint, what do you do with that? So the most common approach is to use it as a frozen encoder, and you say, I'm not touching those weights, I use them as a feature extraction, and I will train some shallow machine learning model on top of it that becomes your input, essentially, which has a lot of advantages because it's fewer parameters, it's computationally cheaper, you're using less memory, you're less likely to overfit because you're not training the big neural network, you're just training a little thing on top. The problematic part is you really need a good model, and a model that produces, let's say, relevant features for your task. So if you're, I don't know, if you're doing contrastive learning very aggressively with very aggressive views over multiple timestamps, etc., maybe it won't be optimal for change detection because, you know, you're pre-training it to be invariant to change, and then someone comes with a downstream task where they want to detect a single tree that got cut. Not sure that will work. So you need features that are really useful for your downstream task, and that's the challenging part. And that's kind of the holy grail of foundation models, if you can really build something that generalizes very well to everything. And we're, I guess, not there yet. You have the full fine-tuning approach, which kind of defeats the purpose of a foundation model, because this would mean you fine-tune the entire thing, all the weights, you adapt them to your downstream tasks. So in a sense, it's a bit similar to training from scratch, which has a lot of disadvantages, like prone to overfitting. It's computationally more demanding because you train a very deep network, and you could run into catastrophic forgetting. So you take, you know, a step with the wrong learning rate, and you're gone. Your pre-trained weights are basically flushed. It has some advantages if you do it right, very carefully, with right hyperparameters, and you have enough data. That's likely the way you will get the, let's say, best results in terms of pure benchmarks. But it kind of defeats the purpose. And then you have the efficient adaptation kind of family of models, and there's a whole literature on this. I'm not covering that. For example, LoRa. But the idea is to go in between these two guys and say, hey, maybe we don't want to fine-tune the entire model. Maybe we don't want to keep it completely frozen. Maybe we want to adjust a few weights here and there. And there are methods to do this. So it's computationally more efficient. It enables some adaptation of the pre-trained model, but it adds some extra implementation complexity and hyperparameters and this and that. So it's also not trivial to use. And given that you have, well, a lot of foundation models, a lot of papers doing SSL, then comes the question of how do you even compare such papers, right? So if every paper comes with its own benchmark or uses a different downstream task, then it's not really useful. So people have been working on trying to converge towards some unified benchmarks that maybe other people will pick up. And I'm just listing a few here. So this Pangaya thingy, which has some bioma stuff, segmentation, whatever, crop type. Is there a crop type there? No, maybe not. Also water pollution detection. So just a compilation of representative downstream tasks. And it's getting some momentum now. So people are using it in foundation models to evaluate them. There's a whole Python package to do it easily. So there's also, GeoBench, which is another alternative to this one. And there's this CVPR Earth Vision Challenge, which was organized by a colleague at DLR this year. And this one is interesting because they came up with a challenge setting where the downstream tasks for the users are hidden. So the users need to train their foundation model or whatever method they want to use, and they need to provide their checkpoints, which will be used to compute embeddings. And those embeddings will be used to solve downstream tasks which the participants have no idea about. So they're completely hidden, no one knows the labels, no one knows the tasks, and everything is computed on the fly. And that's maybe one interesting way to do it to avoid overfitting on downstream tasks. So if someone comes with 100 GPUs versus you have your Colab notebook, they will have way more budget to tune all their parameters to fit the downstream task. At least here, you have to make a submission to get results back, etc. So yeah, it prevents overfitting on the problems, essentially. Okay, and how well do these foundation models work once you've evaluated them and started comparing them? This is a table from the TerraMind paper, and which came out this year. It is kind of, would argue, state of the art. And it is indeed the best in the table if you look at the average rank. But I want to draw your attention to this line here. So the UNet baseline, trained from scratch on a lot of data sets, and out of 4 data sets, it's getting the best result. So I would argue UNets are not dead yet, and there's probably a lot of reasons why this would happen. We don't really have time to discuss this, but I'm offline here at some point if you want to chat. But this is just to say that if you have a concrete problem you want to solve, I would still argue, please go for a simple baseline first. Train your model, see if you get, any good results. If it doesn't work, try one of these fancy models. Or maybe you get lucky and end up in one of those downstream tasks where there's actually real benefit. Or maybe, UNet will be just fine. So that's kind of a takeaway. I want you to have in mind that these foundation models aren't yet at the stage where they're solving every problem. But there's some exciting literature, a lot of things are happening, people are throwing in extraordinary resources on this, so things will improve for sure. And there's also still interesting things you can do with those embeddings in an unsupervised way, like image retrieval, clustering, etc. That's probably something where I would definitely pick up a checkpoint from one of those papers I mentioned, rather than a model trained supervised, which will collapse the representations into something super specific to the downstream task. So yeah, that's kind of the takeaway. Okay, conclusion. So foundation models, pros and cons. Advantages, you get very strong generalization capabilities. You can use them with little to no fine-tuning, so they kind of work out of the box. You can get this off-shelf embeddings, as I was saying earlier, that can really be used in a nice way, because then you can do clustering, you can do image retrieval in an unsupervised way, do some data analysis. There can be, depending on the problems and the models, more label efficient. So training from scratch a neural network still requires some data, and maybe if you have a tiny data set, you'll want to go to random forest or something, which might be another hard baseline to beat. And it's cool branding, so it's always cool to say you have your foundation model, And for the limitations, so there's the high inference cost and the high memory cost. So they are pretty polyvalent, so good in many downstream tasks, that's true, but they're not necessarily SOTA in any of them. So you're keeping the encoder frozen, and keep in mind you're asking a lot from this encoder. You really want it to work on downstream tasks where very different things matter from the input side. And so, yeah, it's kind of these situations where it's pretty okay at everything, but not excelling at any of them compared to task-specific, highly tuned models. They suffer from some of the limitations they inherit from the neural network architecture, so VITs with pixel-level tasks, and some difficulties there. And they still require some labels unless you have something promptable. So once you have your pre-trained model, you still need a task-specific head to train it on your labeled subset for your task of interest. Okay, promise, this is the last slide. So there's more than 100 foundation model papers out there. There's a trend towards multi-model foundation models, more data, more sensors, more claims. There's interesting research going on in the climate foundation model sphere. So I haven't covered that, but there's a paper from IBM also on this, PRIT-VW something, whatever. I think more research might be needed and more work is needed towards fair evaluation of these models, really extract the actual use cases where you benefit the most from them and have proper comparison with well-tuned baselines to be able to, make nuanced claims and kind of really get to the core of when does it help, when does it not. So foundation models aren't the solution to everything yet. Let's see how things go. And the development of a truly universal foundation model is still an open challenge. So no matter what any paper will claim, we're still not there. But people are working on it. And I hope this presentation kind of sparkled some interest in some of you to maybe contribute to this or get familiar with the literature or, yeah. And that's it. Thanks a lot. You're the organizer. I'm not sure if we have time for questions. Maybe they want to have their coffee break, as you like.
Is the microphone?
Do you have any question? Quick question for Nassim? Yes?
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. It's really great presentations. And yeah, I want to ask like two-part questions. First, I think it's like in many foundational papers, they also claim that their best performance is if the end, like the later user will use also and adapt a backbone that's similar to them. So is it like a backbone variance? You can say that whether if we want to do some training or using a certain foundation model that we need to adapt as well the certain backbone to implement this kind of similar or reach an optimal performance. The second part is whether this foundation model is resolution variance, so ground sampling distance type, kind of like whether, as you say, like when we use ImageNet, it's a different perspective and paradigm to the remote sensing part. And I think most of the paper is using like medium to low resolution of the remote sensing task, high resolution in the term of like higher than half meters kind of resolution ground sampling distance. And do you think this will be have a particular different variance? Because in the term of the resolution, because I think we tried to do a reconstruction task for higher resolutions to reconstruct a different seasonal variations, and it wasn't really changed, and not either also to change the reconstruction of architectural variation, so to say. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, let me see if I got it right. So the first question was, you observed that from the papers, it sounds like if you want to optimize for the benchmarks, you end up fine-tuning the encoder. Is that what you were asking?
Yeah, yeah. And then so we need to like fully adapt the whole backbone, so to say.
Yeah, so it depends, but to some extent, yes. Then you also have some benchmarks and like this Pangaya thingy that I was mentioning, which recommends, or at least part of the protocol, when they say in the paper we follow this and that, just cite in the paper, they will keep the encoder frozen in general. Doesn't mean your decoder will not be huge. So you have to be careful, because if they go for some big embedding space and add some convolutions with big kernels, you might end up with a 50 million parameter decoder. So you also have to be careful with that. Yeah, I would say it depends. It also depends on how much labels you have, and any results where, at least conclusions we're drawing from all of these papers will be highly dependent on the benchmarks themselves. So yeah, it really depends on how much data you have. Sometimes if you fine-tune not properly or not carefully enough, you will overfit and get worse results. So it depends how you do it. The second question is about the spatial resolution, right? You were saying that most papers go for medium to low resolution data and not enough into the high resolution. So SkySense, the one I skipped, had something like, I don't know, 20 million maxar images. I'm not really sure what's the exact resolution. It's sub-meter, but I don't know exactly how much. And Dino V3, they also have trained on 400 million maxar imagery. So I'm not really sure, again, what was the spatial resolution, but again, less than 1 meter. So these two on top of my mind have used large data sets. And I would say the limit is basically it's commercial missions. So you need to have the money to buy this. And then, you know, once you train your model, you can't necessarily release the data. So SkySense, the paper I skipped, the data set is not public. I guess it's the same for Dino v3. I haven't checked the details. So it's also a data accessibility issue. If you need to work on high resolution, I would recommend maybe trying out Dino v3 because they seem to be, have pretty nice results.
Yeah, but the question is whether like low resolutions kind of foundation model can be transferable to like higher resolution downstreams. Like,
without any fine tuning, I don't know. So you would need to give it a try. But I would compare to other baselines as well, and I would expect maybe so this Panopticon paper that, whatever, so Panopticon paper, the one that claimed they could generalize to every sensor and try to do something, characterize the sensor, they also had an interesting baseline, and that they really highlighted in the paper. They took the Dino v2 checkpoint, and they just tune the patch embedding layer. So they keep everything frozen, except the very first linear projection of the VIT that they train. And they got very good results with that. It was pretty close to the model they were selling in the paper, beating some other pre-trained models. So, you know, if you have a great spatial feature extractor like Dino v2 and even more Dino v3, since they also trained it on satellite imagery, it could be the case that you just need to, you know, play a little bit with the channel layers, the very early ones, and maybe you get something good enough. So, yeah, that would be... there's no way to tell in advance if the low resolution model will work better than something trained on natural imagery. If you fine tune both, you have to try. But yeah, it won't perfectly work out of the box. I wouldn't expect that. Hi everyone. Okay. Okay, so there will be 2-3 introductory slides with a link to a GitHub so that you can access the Jupyter notebook, the Google Colab thing. I really hope everyone has a Google account. I couldn't find any safer or more widespread alternative. If someone here doesn't have a Gmail, like Google account, please raise your hand. We'll try to deal with it. Nice, okay. So, for the practical, we'll cover the paper that I briefly mentioned. So we'll be using the code base from this paper, Spectral Earth, which is something we worked on at DLR and TUM. And it's essentially a combination of a pre-training data set to train hyperspectral foundation models. So as I mentioned earlier, it's based on Nmap. So that's the German hyperspectral satellite run by DLR, which was launched mid-2022. And yeah, what I've done is basically I've downloaded something like 11,000 tiles manually from the EU web portal of DLR. And then, you know, pre-process the data, Apacheifying everything, and this and that. And yeah, this led to this pre-training data set, which is now available. You'll only get a very tiny subset of it, just downloadable today for the summer school, but the proper way to access it will be on the DLR Geo portal. You just register an account, and the instructions are there in the Jupyter notebook. But that would be if later you're interested into checking out the full data set. And so, yeah, the motivation was the lack of good pre-training data set for hyperspectral imagery. And this is what Spectral Earth tries to address, along with a set of checkpoints of pre-trained models that people could potentially try on their downstream tasks. And so this is an overview of the spatial distribution of the Spectral Earth dataset. So this is Nmap. Every pixel is 30-meter resolution, so much like Landsat. And there are 202 bands, 224, but then water absorptions, this and that. So in practice today, you'll get 200 spectral bands to play with. And the dataset, the full one, not the one you'll download today, has 538,000 patches. Spanning 400,000 roughly unique locations. So these are locations that are non-overlapping. And there is a subset of the locations, did the best I could to match as many as possible that have more than one timestamp. Because one thing you have to know with these hyperspectral satellites, like Nmap, is that they're task-based. And so people ask for requests over regions, and then the satellite passes over there to collect some data. So it's not extensively mapping the Earth like Sentinel-2. Basically, because you have so many bands that you have storage issues on the satellite and whatever. So many issues coming from the hyperspectral dimension. And these are flaws that should be corrected in the next CHIME mission scheduled by ESA in a few years. So the data set in total is 3 terabytes of data. It was manually curated, so it's cloud free, or mostly. Here are a few samples which have multiple timestamps from Spectral Earth visualized in RGB, so you get to play with that. And we also compiled a bunch of downstream tasks to be able to evaluate the models we pre-train by basically aligning some of the imagery we had with Nmap with land cover products, crop type products like CDL, tree species products like Baie des Forêts in France, Eurocrops. This is the one you will play with today, so it's crop types aligned with Nmap imagery, single timestamps, because time series in Hyperspectral are nearly impossible to get due to the revisit frequency. And it's also a subset of the data set because Colab isn't, you don't get that much resources in the end, so we have to keep it small scale. And for the architecture, since it was a dataset paper, we didn't want to go into fancy modeling, so we went for the simplest possible solution, which is to take some of the vanilla computer vision models and add a spectral adapter before, which takes care of the spectral feature extraction, which turns out to be a pretty powerful baseline compared to more complicated things we tried or are currently trying. And the checkpoints are available. We pre-trained several models, and you'll be able to download some, maybe try them, try to fine-tune them. And yeah, just a subset of the results we got. So pre-training seems to improve label efficiency and convergence speed with compared to fine-tuning, to training from scratch, sorry. But this is with fine-tuning. But the models are kept relatively small, so I wasn't too big of a fan of going with a 1 billion parameter model on this amount of data. So the models are, of decently sized, and you can easily fine-tune them and fine-tune all the weights. And you get some benefits compared to training from scratch. And you also get even more benefits when the labels are limited. So if you start subsampling the downstream data sets, even fine-tuning this adapter thing, which is just the 1D convolutions at the beginning, starts beating training from scratch, which is where you train a few million or tens of millions of parameters. So enough with the slides. Let's go to the practical. So here's a tiny link thingy to access Behnood's repo. And yeah, this one should work. When we just remove the mouse, so it shouldn't matter. So you can try either the QR code or just type the tiny URL. Don't worry, it's just a GitHub repo. It's just shorter to type than the full one. And at this point, I'm gonna start sharing my screen once you all are on the GitHub page. Let me see if I should consider sharing internet with my phone. It's gonna drop for a second. Let me run a speed test. Okay, let me just try with my phone. Let's see if it does anything. Tap. Finger crossed. Please, please work. Okay. So it looks like my internet provider is doing a great job. Wait a second. Great, it works. Okay, so I hope you managed to get past this point. Now, for most of you, you should just click on the icon, open in Colab, and that should show you the Jupyter notebook loaded in Colab. Yes, and of course it's in German, because why not? Auf Englisch, bitte. Okay, so let's see. The very first step for everyone would be to set the runtime to GPU. Because if you only use the CPU, you will download the data, it will decompress, and then you will have to change runtime and lose everything. So very first step, very important. Let me do it here slowly. You go to runtime, you go to change runtime type, and you select the T4 GPU here, and save. So this will, yep, okay, and then you can connect to the runtime. So the very first part is some introductory material about the data we will be using, the downstream tasks, etc. There are a few links, you can follow them. I encourage you to read a little bit and not just click on run all, but you do whatever you want. So these are the code and tools that we'll be using. You will see some stuff written in PyTorch Lightning. I don't know if everyone is familiar, but it's not. It's just a wrapper around PyTorch, but it's just more structured code, so it should be the same. Don't get scared from that. And we're also using this lightly SSL thing. So if you're really reading the code and checking the mask autoencoder code, maybe you will see some magic loss imported from somewhere. It's coming from this library. And if you want to see the internals and want to go deep into it, you can follow the link and check the methods available there. Okay, very, very first step, we will clone the repo. Run anyway. Okay, so this will clone the repository of the summer school thing. And now we're also going to clone the Spectral Earth repository, so the paper I was discussing earlier, and it will install all the requirements, so all the packages that we need. And after this step, in order, did I have a run-in session already? Okay, or maybe not, no. Okay, so after it installs everything, you will be prompted to restart the environment such that the installed packages are taken into account. Otherwise, it won't detect them. Yeah, exactly. So you get this pop-up, and you should click on Restart Session. Okay. And now you just continue wherever you stopped. So the previous cell was the installation. Now we just enter inside the directory for the summer school. And this is just a verification cell, this Python path setup, that will check that you have everything in order, or like import some things and some terrible Python path things for the imports to work. We run this, you should get these green marks and all the directories there. And then we just move inside the Spectral Earth directory, which will be the main code base we'll be using. So you just click on this. I'm just clicking through cells essentially here. And ideally do this once unless the environment restarts, because there will be you'll be in some directory and then you try to run it again and it doesn't exist. So all of this should just be ran once unless the environment restarts. And now we can check if the imports are working. So we will import a semantic segmentation module to be used later in the Jupyter notebook. We'll import the Spectral Earth dataset, data module. That's just some data classes in PyTorch and PyTorch Lightning. This backbone registry thing. And if you've selected the GPU environment in Colab, you should see here using device CUDA. So if you see CPU, something went wrong with or if you do it locally and you see CPU, it didn't detect the GPU, so better backtrack and we can troubleshoot later, but you should see CUDA here. Okay, now we can download the very small subset of data that dedicated for just this summer school. And there will be two things. There's the pre-trained, so to say, data, but it's really a tiny subset, just for you to experiment a little bit. And there's the downstream task, which is an even smaller subset with labels. And this is this Euro crops label, so it's crop type classification or segmentation, if you want, with nmap images. This takes a few minutes to download the data. And then the other slow step, because Colab is input-output isn't very fast, is the decompression, so the cell after. You just run the download, and whenever it's done, so it's relatively fast, you can unzip the data by running the next cell, and then the one after is just freeing some space from the disk by removing the zip files, the compressed version that we don't need anymore. So I'm just running through all the cells and running them one by one. So nothing much happening here. It's all to set up the environment. The decompression will take a few minutes, so maybe everyone try to get to that point and run it. And I can then walk you through the rest of the Jupyter notebook while the data is decompressing. So this is just a small trick to move the splits for the subset we're using. Just run the command here. And then we have a verification cell to make sure that everything is in order. So we need the Spectral Earth repo, we need the data that has been downloaded and will be decompressed once the cell runs. And yeah, so you just run it, and hopefully you will only see green check marks. If you see any of the red crosses, then something went wrong, and you should go back and check if one of the cells failed, or if you forgot to run one of them. And yeah, so all of this was to set up everything. Once you're done with this, you can start playing with the data, models, and everything. So this is section 2, essentially. This is where the real stuff happens. And yeah, while the data is being decompressed, I'm going to just walk you through the structure of the Jupyter notebook, and then you can play with it as you want. Okay, so there's some blah, blah, blah on hyperspectral imagery, the spectral Earth dataset, some of its characteristics, etc. Feel free to read or skip. And then, yeah, so you can essentially go through, just read the markdown and run the cells. It should run unless something goes wrong. So there's a cell for the creation of the dataset that you can run. This will create the dataset object in PyTorch. And then there's a visualization cell. I have some outputs from the previous run here, and you should also see them. So this is just data visualization with the Nmap data that we have here. So this tiny subset with a few patches. And what we're showing is basically some of the spectral bands from different wavelengths plotted one against each other, so that you can see roughly how, well, every wavelength reacts, and yeah, things like that. So then there you have the RGB kind of composite, just by taking 3 bands with the relevant wavelengths and plotting it as RGB. And you have the PCA false color plot. So this is taking the spectral bands, applying PCA to every pixel independently, principal component analysis. So it's just taking 202 values and compressing it to 3 values, and then plotting this as RGB image. It's a fake RGB image. And it gives you these kind of very colorful plots that kind of reflect what additional information the spectrum provides, and some of the things that you can only see outside of the visible range, or yeah, outside of RGB essentially. And then on the right, you can see the spectral signatures here and there. So it's randomly selected pixels from the image, and then you have on the x-axis the wavelength in nanometer, and on the y-axis the reflectance from the L2A product that we're using. And yeah, it's basically, if you've never seen hyperspectral data, this is what it looks like. Every pixel essentially is a curve, you could say. And you have some discontinuities because the atmosphere that absorbs some stuff, etc. So it's hard to get any signal there. So these bands are discarded. This is just for the next cell to get an interactive visualization. So this one will just plot stuff. And if you run it multiple times, you'll get a different image. So if you just want to spend your time looking at colorful images, you can, yeah, run it multiple times. And then you have the, okay, this cell is just doing some import that is specific to Colab. And this one, okay, too bad I don't have the output. So this one is an interactive version kind of the previous one. So if you click on this cell and run it, maybe if data decompression is done, I will also do it. Okay, it's not done yet. Let me go back here. So interactive plot inside data visualization. And for this one, if you run it, you will get RGB image, PCA plot, and the RGB image will be clickable. So wherever you put your mouse and click, it will change this red cross, which hopefully we will see in a few minutes once the data is decompressed. And you can basically visualize the entire spectrum for multiple pixels in the image. So you can just click here and there and see what the underlying hyperspectral dimension looks like in terms of spectral signature, essentially. Yep. And then this is another visualization, because we like hyperspectral. And it's basically the temporal dimension of spectral Earth. So I was mentioning that the subset of the data has multiple timestamps, which in hyperspectral data is not very easy to get, because you need the satellite to revisit the same place, and it's tricky. So we have a subset of locations which have that in spectral Earth, and here we're just visualizing those with multiple timestamps. And this is an interactive plot, And the message I want to convey with this plot is for you to click again on the pixel locations. You will see, it's a bit annoying to explain it without the data. Are we almost done with that? Yeah, the compression is slow. So better run it as soon as possible if you haven't yet. Yeah, so what you will see is basically, okay, I think it ran. Great, okay, I can do it live then. I just create the data set again. Data visualization, this is the plot I was talking about. It generated a new image. So you can see these are multiple bands plotted individually. And these are, yeah, this is the PCA false color thing with the spectras. And then this is the interactive plot where you can actually click on the pixel, and then it moves. And then you see the spectral reflectance. So if you look at water, it's, yeah, very low reflectance consistently. If you go to the cloud, you'll see something a bit more spiky. Go to land, and if you just want to change the image, you just run it. It will pick up something else. Yeah, so you can play with that if you want. And then the temporal thingy, there you go. So this one will display some samples for which we have multiple timestamps in Spectral Earth. And then if you click on a pixel, it will show you the spectral reflectance of the same pixel, same location, across the two timestamps. So I clicked here, I get the spectral reflectance for the same location, but two timestamps. And this is just to show you the spectral variability, essentially. So if you have a model that only looks at the spectrum without the spatial dimension, it's really hard to get around all this variance. I can click on some, so there's some intrinsic variance from the acquisition conditions and this and that, but there's also variance from the changes on the ground. And you know, this is a good example, I think. You have like, it's probably from different seasons, and you will see that, yeah, one of the images is green and the other are brownish. And this is what the reflectance for the same location, same pixel, looks like for different timestamps. So you see that it's nothing alike, and yet somehow on the ground, this is the same spatial location. And if you're training a hyperspectral model without taking into account the spatial context, you cannot really call this invariance because they look so different. You have no proper way to really distinguish it. And yeah, so it's you can also play with this kind of visualizations if you want. It's a snowy example. Okay, and that's all when it comes to the data visualization. And now we have the self-supervised pre-training part. So here we're covering mask autoencoders, which Behnood explained earlier, and I gave you a few examples of papers using that. So this is an instance of mask autoencoder implementation that we will run on the Spectral Earth dataset. So you have this MAE Lightning module, which is essentially a copy-paste from our Spectral Earth GitHub repo. So I'm putting it here so that if you feel comfortable, you can try to read it, go through it. There will be some things that you can ignore. For instance, this is just data augmentation. This is just instantiating the backbone. But essentially, maybe you can have a look at the forward pass, forward encoder, decoder, training step, if you feel like you want to see how these methods are implemented in practice. And sometimes you'll have some classes imported from the SSL lightly library thing that I was mentioning earlier to abstract away some of the complexity. So if you feel like you really want to go through every instruction and know what's happening under the hood, you should open the lightly GitHub SSL and look at these classes. The mask vision transformer team, there isn't too much happening there, and the decoder, which we're importing from there. But it's just one transformer with depth 1, or it's, yeah, nothing too fancy there. Okay, so this cell, we can run it to define all the classes we need to run mask autoencoder. There you go. And then we can instantiate. So you have to select a backbone name here. And for Spectral Earth, we had we have a ResNet backbone. We have I'll have to check if the parameters are put right in this example, but whatever. You can stick to the VITs. So we have VIT small, VIT base. There's this version with this spec prefix, which is the models we trained, which have the 1D convolutions at the beginning. So for every VIT size, you have the spec VIT tiny, spec VIT small, and you can replace essentially the name here, and if you want to try multiple models. So I'm going for a VIT tiny, which is really small, just to save compute, because we don't have that much memory and compute here. And then I'm creating the MAE module, which was defined in the previous cell. So this has all the hyperparameters that are needed. You select the backbone name. You have a patch size, which is essentially the image size in Spectral Earth. So it's 128 by 128 pixels. You have the token patch size, which is, if you remember in a VIT, you have to cut the image into smaller patches. This is essentially the size of those patches. So it means it's 4 by 4, 4 by 4 by 202. Number of channels as input, you don't change that, it's fixed. The masking ratio, so MAE, you mask part of the input and you train the model to reconstruct what's missing. The question is, how much of the input do you mask? And as Behnood said in the presentation, typically people use masking ratios above 75% because spatially the data is very redundant and you can kind of guess what's missing just with 25% of pixels, of patches, also pixels. So you can play with this hyperparameter, and this is also part of the exercise if you want to try multiple configurations. And you have to keep in mind that this one interacts with this one, because the masking happens at a token level, so you're dropping tokens, which means here we are masking 85% of the 4 by 4 patches. Masking 85% of the 4 by 4 patches is very different from masking 85% of the 16 by 16 patches, because, well, you can try it yourself, right? If you have a small patch size, you can kind of get a uniform masking and you still have visible pixels everywhere. Whereas if you have big patches, you may end up with the upper half of the image for which you have no data at all because it has been masked. So the coarser the tokens, the lower the masking ratio you need to have. So yeah, 85, 90% for 4 by 4 with this patch size is reasonable. You can also stick to the default parameters. Then we create this data module thingy, which is just a wrapper on the dataset class for Lightning. And now we can try to visualize some training. So yeah, maybe if you could pay attention here to this part. I'm not sure how clear the instructions are. So we are in MAE training. We have selected this VIT tiny or spec VIT tiny, which we're gonna fetch. So this is an MAE checkpoint. You'll see why we have this. So it's a masked autoencoder checkpoint that I was pre-training, well, yesterday, I think. And I uploaded here so that you can get a model that ran through enough epochs. So you will see that if you run MAE from scratch, the reconstructions won't really look good. Let's do that. So we go to the cell, create an MAE Lightning, visualization callback, this and that. We click here. And if you notice, there's this checkpoint path here, which I set to none. So this means we start training MAE from scratch. And yeah, the model is randomly initialized, and we want to train it to reconstruct missing patches. Where I clicked on the cell, and the visualization stuff should come very soon. I think I said the frequency. You can also change that. The frequency is 20 iterations. So every 20 batches, you will see a visualization. And this is what the reconstructions look like at the beginning of training. So they are, yeah, I see quite a lot of artifacts. It's also not necessarily clear if better reconstructions always mean better model. It depends on many things, right? So if you don't mask anything in the input, you get great reconstructions, but you're essentially telling the network to reconstruct, you know, it's an identity function with compression in the middle. It won't learn something very useful for pre-training. So let's say hyperparameters equal with everything set the same. It's possible that a model that reconstructs better the input is better for a downstream task, but the correlation is kind of fuzzy. So this thing, MAE in general, is not optimized like a diffusion model. It's not meant to give you perfectly realistic looking images. It will give you something very blurry, very this and that, but this is very bad. This is beginning of training. If you want to see what a model that has been trained for long enough, although it's small, yeah, look at this one, great. If you want to see what it looks like to have a model pre-trained for long enough, you can pick one of those checkpoints, one of those variables, MAE VIT tiny checkpoint or MAE spec VIT checkpoint, depending on what you selected. So we have the spec VIT here in the backbone name. So we will take this guy, we copy, and then we resume the training of this guy. So this will take a checkpoint that I pre-trained before with MAE, and we will continue to train it so that you can see what decent reconstructions look like, although it's a very small model, it's, yeah. But still, you will notice that it's better than if you start from scratch. You can play with that. Oh, Jesus Christ, no, that's not better. Maybe I didn't set it right. Okay, I have to double check this. It's supposed to be better. Is this an unlucky sample? Yeah, the loss value you will see is now it's 10 times lower than the previous. So there's a difference. I don't know what's happening with this sample. This is interesting. Let's see if the next one is as bad. No, it's not. Okay. I don't know what happened with that sample. So this is what the MAE looks like after some training. Although it's a relatively small model, you can see that, you know, this is the original image, some rocky thing. I don't know if there's a glacier here. And then it's masked 85%. And you can see that the model kind of gets it. So it's reconstructing something that seems to be filling the gaps. So again, it's not also meant to be looking perfectly, because the decoder itself in MAE has a relatively small capacity. The decoder is small, and it's part of, if you read the MAE paper, they have an ablation on that. So having a big decoder is not really necessarily the greatest idea. But some samples are, it might be because the model is very small. Usually it's more consistent than that. You can also try the VIT version, not spec. Maybe it will be more consistent. So that cell above continues or trains from scratch in a model using MAE. If you want to train a model for 20 minutes or something and then save your checkpoint locally on Colab, so if you want to get back the encoder, because we have an encoder, decoder, all wrapped in this MAE module, what you're interested in is the encoder part if you're doing a downstream task. So to do that, you just run this cell. This takes the MAE model, it extracts the encoder, it saves it to a checkpoint, and this is the path. So you have this backbone file name thing, which, no, sorry, backbone safe path with the directory. And this variable, if you run this cell and you are interested in trying out your model, so the one you've trained here for certain iterations, if you want to try it later for the downstream task, you should use this variable. You should put this checkpoint, you will see later where. So I'm just gonna run the cell to save a dummy checkpoint, which we trained for 40 iterations. So not much happened there. Nope, 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 no saving. And this cell, just ignore this one. Okay, so this was the pre-training part. I have at the end, so this exercise, blah, 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 blah. So it tells you the kind of parameters you can play with if you want. If you wanna change the batch size, this token batch size thing, for instance, where did I put it? It was with the backbone name. So you can play with this hyperparameter, for instance, and see how this influences the reconstructions. What happens if you have a big batch size? What happens with a very small batch size? Be careful, I wouldn't go below 4, because otherwise it's very demanding. VITs, they scale quadratically with the attention, with respect to the input length. So I wouldn't go below 4. Otherwise, you may crash the GPU memory and you will restart the session. But you can try 8, 16. It should run faster, and you will see how it looks like compared to 4x4. You can also play with the masking ratio, definitely. See what happens if you allow the model to see a lot of the image, what happens if you mask out almost everything. So you can play with that. Yep, and you can also read up on the code if you want to go a little bit more advanced on MAE and if you're interested in changing things. So this was on the pre-training phase. Then there's the downstream tasks. So given that you have a checkpoint, you can either download one of the checkpoints I trained for the Spectral Earth paper, or you can use the one you train here live, basically, for the downstream tasks just by specifying the path. So downstream task overview, this is just some of the tasks we have on the Spectral Earth paper. And here we're using this Euro crops thing. So it's crop type classification, one timestamp in summer, nmap imagery, segmentation labels. Before we start training, we can visualize some of the data. So you will see that if you have an image over an urban area, most of the pixels are not cropped. That's why you'll have all of this background, which is kind of ignored in the training process. So what we really focus on is the parts that are not black. This is the foreground, the crop types. And you can see samples of images and corresponding labels with the crops. And this is just the legend of the crop types basically available in the data set. So this is just to visualize the data that you would train on for the downstream tasks. And then you can basically do transfer learning, fine-tuning, frozen encoder evaluation, whatever you want, using a pre-trained model. And here, there's some code to retrieve pre-trained models that I have pre-trained before. So you just run this cell to define them, and then you specify maybe one backbone name, okay? And you run this function to fetch from Hugging Face the backbones corresponding to this pair of pre-training algorithm and backbone name. So here I'm fetching MAE for this spec VIT tiny model, and you have the valid pairs that are specified in the previous cell. So all of these models are available. You can actually download them here and try them out on the downstream task. So backbone name, then checkpoint path. We can check that it was indeed downloaded and it's stored in this temporary directories with very nice names. And then we can create the segmentation module. So this is wrapping over the complexity of having encoder, decoder, segmentation model, blah, 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 blah. So all of this is defined in this semantic segmentation module. That's not really the point of the lecture since we were focusing on pre-training, but if you want to see what it looks like, you can also see it in the Spectral Earth repo. But otherwise, you can just define it. And the important parameters are the backbone name. So to tell them, to tell the segmentation module, you want to use this architecture, VIT tiny, VIT small, spec, blah, blah, blah. You have to, these things you don't have to change. They are data dependent. Channels, image size, that's also fixed. And this is the important one maybe. So the pre-trained weights, you can select the checkpoint path, this variable, which contains the checkpoints we downloaded. Or if you want to train your own and save it, you go back to the MAE cells, you run MAE for some epochs, it will keep saving things, and then you just run the cell below the backbone extraction. This will save the model that you pre-trained, either by continuing pre-training from a checkpoint I'm providing or starting it from scratch. You will get it into this checkpoint, and this will be stored in, this variable, backbone save path. So if you take this variable and you put it here, so the checkpoint path, you replace this one with this, you'll get basically, as a pre-trained model, the one you pre-trained and not one downloaded from here. You can also set this to none, and this will do training from scratch, plain supervised learning. So I'm listing it as part of the exercises below. You can definitely play with the architecture, with the pre-trained weights. So what happens if you put in your own pre-trained model? What happens if you train from scratch with none? What kind of results do you get with one of those models that were pre-trained in Spectral Earth? Just by playing with this parameter, essentially. And you can also play again with the token patch size. So if you've trained yourself a model with 16 by 16 patch size, you can replace here with the path to that model, which is that variable I was talking about, and then rerun it again. So you can play with these hyperparameters and see the interplay with, that's also the not so fun part about SSL and these kind of things, is that whenever you're changing something during the pre-training stage, you have to run that on the downstream tasks, and eventually not one, but many. So it kind of multiplies the effort every time. Instead of doing one run for pre-training, you change something and then you have to evaluate on 5 tasks. So that's kind of the challenge here. You end up changing something above and then, oops, I also need to run it for the downstream tasks and see how things correlate. And then, okay, this is just printing the neural network architecture, creating data module. This is just instantiating whatever you need to train. And here you can specify the maximum number of epochs. So I'm setting 5 just because Colab is slow. So I would, if you want to run this multiple times with different models and this and that, I would stick to 5. But of course, that's not ideal for evaluating a pre-trained model. So in the paper, we use the 100. We could go to 200 epochs. So this will only give you the trends during early training. And you should observe things like a pre-trained model starts at a higher stage and is better at the end of the 5 epochs. And if you run this, you will also get the logs of the mean IOU and everything. So Maybe I can still quickly run it here to see if it works. So visualizing the network and then creating the data for the downstream task. Top, just running everything. And this should start training the downstream task with the setting that was selected. Oh, there's also another hyperparameter that is quite important. It's this freeze backbone. So if you set it to true, you're not changing your pre-trained model, it's frozen. If you set it to false, it will fine-tune the entire model. So you have the two alternatives here. That's also something you can play with to see how it compares with frozen backbone versus full fine-tuning. So if I have freeze backbone false and pre-train none, this essentially means I'm training from scratch on the downstream task. Where was I? Okay. It's logging for every epoch, and this is the main bottleneck on Colab. It's relatively slow. That's why you shouldn't go maybe for more than 5 epochs. It's like 45 seconds per epoch. Yeah. So this is just loading a validation step, and then you should start seeing some results. So you will see the training loss, validation loss. It will show up in the next epoch, and it will also show you some examples of the images, the masks, and the predictions of the network. So this is early training. They're completely off. As you can see, the colors don't match at all. If you train it for long enough, or fine-tune for long enough, you start getting stuff that matches. With 5 epochs, yeah, I don't know how good the results will be. But at least you can do relative comparisons. So you can see, you will be able to see the difference if you start with the pre-trained models after the 5 epochs versus training from scratch, fine-tuning versus frozen encoder. If you play with this, you should be able to keep track of some of the trends, essentially. So that's something you can play with. And then I'm just going to interrupt it. And final visualization cells. This is TSNE plots. So I mentioned earlier that you can use pre-trained models to do clustering over the embedding space and do image retrieval and this and that. So that's something you can potentially try here. You can instantiate a backbone. This is the important instruction. And you can get a checkpoint for that backbone with a specific pre-training algorithm if it's available, or plug in your own if you want. And then all the rest of the code, I mean, you can ignore it essentially. It's just calculating the embeddings for all the images and then running TSNE, running PCA, this, blah, blah, blah. We don't really care. And then in the end, you'll just visualize some of the clusters that were created by the pre-trained model, which will have maybe some degree of consistency, maybe not, depends on the samples, depends on the hyperparameters of the clustering, depends on the pre-trained model, if it was trained more like for pixel level tasks or for, So you can see some trends, like here, for example, it had more water images. This is more greenish stuff. Yeah, visualizations of the clusters. You can play with that. It's very hyperparameter dependent, I would say. So this seems to be a cluster that is more focused on crops. So you can play with that. And part of the exercises are already mentioned. So essentially you can play with the hyperparameters for mask autoencoder, masking ratio, patch size, inspect the quality of the reconstructions visually. You can play with the backbone at that point. And here's just a few questions to explore, like how does the masking ratio influence the reconstruction quality? How does the patch size impact the spatial detail preservation, the reconstruction qualities? You can then try those models on the downstream task to also extract some quantitative results. And the other one is comparing multiple backbones. I've also mentioned this, multiple freezing strategies versus fine-tuning, training from scratch, and observe some trends on the trade-offs between performance, training time, data requirements, etc. So this is more like running stuff on the Jupyter Notebook. If at some point you want to go more advanced later offline, or you're interested in exploring these things a little bit more, you can go further and play with the data augmentation pipelines. If you're only using a normal VIT without anything to process the spectral dimension, you're likely going to run into some bottlenecks. For example, the patch embedding layer which will likely get overwhelmed with all the bands that are very correlated. So if you don't have a proper spectral feature extractor, it's not a bad idea to run PCA on the data and then run the compressed version instead of the raw correlated input. So you can play with the data augmentation pipeline, implement PCA, and have it there as a data augmentation to get rid of the redundancy in the bands. You can also play with the backbone. And if you want to go really advanced and you're interested in SSL, you can take the Lightly SSL documentation, and there you will have a bunch of models that are implemented. You just click on one of them, and you will see the PyTorch implementation, Lightning distributed. Here you just need Lightning, and you have kind of a template of how the method is implemented in Lightly. You can take this, adapt it in the Jupyter notebook, and it's very slow. Okay, I have noticed. So yeah, you can play with this, adapt it in the Jupyter notebook, and have a completely different SSL method, kind of pre-implemented in Lightly, but you would have to adjust it to make it work on the data. Yeah, to have it running essentially on the Nmap imagery. That would be the more advanced stuff, but which likely you won't have time to do today, but yeah, the Jupyter notebook is there. Okay, I think that pretty much covers the overall structure. I'll keep walking around to see if people have questions or stuff that is not working. And I think I was told earlier that we would finish 10 minutes early. I don't know if that still holds with the whole electricity break. If it's still the case, then you have roughly 20 minutes left to play. Otherwise, it's 30 or 27. So yeah, I'll be walking around if you have any questions.